Hey friends, it's Jacob. Today I wanted to show you an old painting of mine, one that I did from right when I was first learning how to paint watercolor. Then I'm going to attempt to paint a similar scene, and we'll talk about the things that I've learned from then to now. So here it is. This is a desert scene that I attempted to paint. By this point, I'd say I'd been trying to paint for about a year, roughly. Before I even learned how to paint, I needed to learn how to draw and how to sketch. I didn't even know how to do that when I started. I literally started from zero, basically, art experience. I had dabbled in charcoal and in acrylic, but nothing really stuck. Then I discovered watercolor and realized how amazing it could look. And ever since then, it's been a never-ending quest to make my paintings as good as they possibly can be. And at this point in my journey, this was as good as I could do. And I gotta say, it's not terrible. I'm very surprised. I was expecting to look at this and say, oof, like that's rough, but it's not too bad. For a year's worth of progress, it's not too bad. There are obviously a lot of issues with it that I see. But let's start with the good. I mean, the sky has a pretty smooth gradient to it. I would not use that color towards the horizon. It's a little too obviously yellow for my liking. The sketch underneath is good. I would say you get a sense of perspective. Everything looks accurate, like is represented accurately. It's a pretty simple scene, which to this day I still prefer to paint scenes like this that are simple. Now the issues I see with it, first and foremost, this is painted on some sort of weird, it's called a watercolor board. I would avoid these at all costs. I don't even understand why they're made at all. You can kind of tell that the watercolor was just sitting on the surface and it was having a hard time absorbing into this really hard board. If you want to paint on something like this, just use a block, I would say. But that was my first issue, is I'm painting on this weird board that has no texture. It's completely smooth. The color, there's no color in my shadows. They're just kind of blah, gray. You can see how I've tried to paint around these bushes, how there's these little areas of white around the bushes. Same over here. Instead of just painting through it in the first wash and then coming back over with green, I tried to paint around all the bushes. So there's like these little white halos around all the bushes. It just looks weird. I did a good job attempting to get the texture of the grass going by painting the shadow down into that light area to show the grass poking up in front of that shadow. The biggest issue though I see with this is I'm not really getting a sense of one big connected shape that connects across the entire composition. Everything looks kind of separated and disjointed, if you see what I mean. There's no real flow to this like I would want to do today. So, obviously at this point in my journey, I was still figuring things out and still being extremely frustrated with watercolor and having a hard time understanding why my paintings weren't turning out like the ones I was trying to imitate, like the master artists I was trying to imitate. And there's a lot that I've learned since I painted this scene in, 2020. It's now 2025 as of recording this video. One more thing I would like to point out is you can kind of see how it looks like I've painted over and over and over certain areas instead of just painting it once and leaving it alone and then intentionally layering on top of it. So it doesn't even really look like a watercolor painting. It almost looks more like colored pencil, which I guess is fine, but I wanted it to look like a watercolor, not colored pencil. So let's try to paint a similar scene, and I will show you everything that I've learned since this time, all the techniques and the tricks that I've learned, and hopefully it will turn out better. So here's the scene I'm going to attempt today. Right off the bat, I'm working with a better picture than the one I was working with for the old painting I showed you. It's a lot more dynamic. There's a lot more going on with the lighting. I think it's a stronger composition. You've got this really interesting contrast between very cool colors in the foreground and then these very warm colors all through the middle section of the painting. And this middle section, it's forming kind of a wedge shape, right? The warm colors are forming this wedge shape that come down and kind of get smaller as they go this way. And this is leading your eye towards the centerpiece, which is that Palo Verde tree, which is being silhouetted by the sky. And then secondarily to that, there are these tufts of very yellow orangish grass that are being blasted by that evening sun right over top of this cool, the cool stones, the cool colored stones at the base of this wash. And then off to the left, you've got this pile of debris that's been washed down this dry creek bed during flash flood. I'm nervous about this part, I won't even lie. This part makes me a little nervous because it's extremely complex. There is a lot going on, and I'm going to have to be very careful to not go overboard with this and give just enough detail to get the point across and not distract from what I really want you to be looking at, which is this Palo Verde tree right here. So there's the first lesson I've learned is how to take better photos for painting. And that's something that just comes with a lot of practice and learning how to see the world more in terms of light, shadow, warm, cool, rather than looking at things in terms of what they actually are. So if you squint your eyes, there's a blob of warm colors here, and there's a blob of cool colors here, and there's some interesting connections going on in the shadows. That's really it. So, better reference photos is automatically going to increase your chances of having a better painting. Now, the next thing I learned, and if you've been watching my channel for a while, you know where I'm going with this, is value studies. Possibly the most important technique I've learned is value studies. That will help me break this very complex scene down into three simple elements. Because if I'm looking at this and I just went straight into a painting, I would almost immediately get overwhelmed. And in fact, I gotta be honest, I went to try to paint this the other day and I was like, nope, I'm not doing it. I got overwhelmed immediately. I did. Because I got caught up looking at all these tiny details that there are. But if I had sat down and done a value study of this and forced myself to simplify this into 3 values instead of an infinity of values, I probably would have felt more confident about it. So that's what I'm going to do now. Let's get into the value study. Yes, even at the stage I am now, I still get intimidated by paintings and I still psych myself out and end up not painting anything because I get overwhelmed. So don't feel bad if that happens to you. It's still something that I have come up every now and then. But I now have this amazing tool to help me work through that overwhelm, which is value studies. So the goal of a value study, there's a few of them. One of the biggest ones is breaking this complex scene down into 3 values and only 3 values. And that will force you to make certain decisions to simplify the scene. And I'll show you what I mean. So first, we've got the white of the paper. The white is going to represent the lightest values, all of the lightest values of the painting, all right? Usually that's your sky, any areas that are being directly lit by the sun, any areas of pure white that you want to preserve, any highlights you want to preserve, usually are going to be the light value, which in our case, as I said, is represented by the white of the paper. Now, where this gets really interesting is when we move to the middle value. So I'm looking at my reference photo, I'm squinting my eyes, trying to abstractify this so that I don't see all the crazy detail going on. And I'm starting to see a big shape that's all more or less middle value. Now I need to make some decisions as to what elements of this painting I'm going to include within the middle value. And right off the bat, I can tell you that the ground of the wash in the foreground is going to be middle value. So I got a big old puddle of Payne's Gray mixed up on my palette, and I'm just going to start dropping in the middle value shape. So the ground's all going to be middle value. There's a little area right here where there's a bit of sunlight, kind of dappled sunlight hitting the ground. I am going to want to preserve that, so I'll paint around that. Squinting my eyes as I'm looking at my reference photo really helps with this. Okay. This goes over into this big old pile of leaves, sticks, branches, random stuff that got washed down. Mostly this is going to be middle value. There's going to be a few highlights here and there for random sticks and branches poking out, but for the most part it's just middle value. So that big old pile of garbage right here that is so complex and that had me so freaked out suddenly just became one big shape. It's one big abstract shape. And I'm going to preserve a few highlights here and there on some of the branches. Just a few highlights. All right, and then just continue painting around here in this pile of stuff. Let's jump back over to this side. So that shadow area kind of goes up and back around that tuft of grass. I'm going to want to preserve that. That really pops out in the photo, and I definitely want to emulate that in the painting. Paint around this other tuft of grass. Back up the bank on this side of the wash. There's a little creosote bush right there that's catching the sunlight, but that's probably all going to be middle value, so I'm going to include that in middle value. Most of the time foliage is going to be middle value, just FYI. A little area at the top of the bank that's being lit by the sun. Just kind of loosely drop in this Palo Verde tree. I'm not going to go crazy with painting in any details in the value study. I don't want to spend too long doing this. Just getting the basic rough idea on paper. This creosote bush, I might make that light value, give some nice contrast. Okay, the foliage at the top of the bank will also be middle value. Preserve that highlight where the sun's hitting the top of the bank. Okay, let's see, some shadows, some rocks and stuff. Notice how everything that's middle value, I'm trying to connect it into one shape. One big shape that goes across the entire composition, the entire scene. Okay, and there's another point of connection right here that I found. So from this tree, there's some shadows on this distant hillside up here that I can make middle value. And it's alright if there's a few areas that aren't directly connected to the main shape, like the shadows on this little rocky outcrop up here. And those will provide some nice contrast for this really well lit palo verde tree right here. Another benefit of doing this is I essentially get a practice round for doing the painting, a speed run. So I can get my hand warmed up, get used to some of the brush strokes that I'm going to want to be doing. So when I go to do the actual painting, I've already painted it once, just in grayscale. Alright, there's some shadows and the palo verde. Connect that down to the shadows in this big pile of stuff here. Okay, anything else? Yeah, that's pretty much it for the middle value. So we've got our lights, we've got our middle value, which is one big shape. All the middle value elements are connected. I'm just looking one more time to see if there's anything else I need to make middle value. No, I think that's pretty much it. I'm pretty content with that, so now we're just going to paint in a few darks here and there within the middle value shape. So this will be our third value. There's a few branches and stuff at the bottom of the wash, some twigs and debris. You get these big flash floods that come through these washes and just all kinds of stuff rushes down the creek bed. You get these big storms out here that just dump all kinds of rain, and the rain stays on the surface instead of soaking into the ground because it's so dry. So all that rain has to go somewhere. Flash floods are a big thing out here in Arizona, in the desert. So I'm darkening up some of the shadows back here, just giving it a little more texture. Paint around that palo verde tree. Darken up some of this too, probably. I will darken up some of the branches in this guy. There are these really interesting epiphytic plants. These parasitic plants growing on the palo verde in these little clumps. I believe they're a kind of mistletoe, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, and when we paint our darks, that's when we can really find separation between different objects. But if there's ways that we can connect the darks into one shape that fits within the middle value, then even better. Anywhere that you can find connection is a good thing. There's some areas in this pile of stuff I'm going to darken up too, just to highlight a few branches here and there. I'm not going to paint every single branch. That is a ridiculous thing to try to do. But I'm going to paint a few and just give some texture, just enough to get the idea across. dark branches in this palo verde tree too. Okay, let's see, anything else? Maybe a few more areas in this pile. So there we have it. There is our value study. So this big shape is going to be what really sells the composition. You're going to be able to tell what's going on from standing across the room. Now all we need to do is paint the same thing again, but in color. So let me reset my workspace and we'll get right into it. All right, I've got my value study, I've got my reference photo, I've got my sketch. I think we're ready to go. Another thing I've changed since that old painting that I showed you is I got a bigger palette. Game changer. I would highly recommend, if you want to paint in a more loose and free way, that you get a big palette. This gives you a lot more space for mixing, and it's just so much easier. So the first thing I'm going to do before I put any paint on this paper is wet it down on both sides, front and back. And I'm going to use this sponge here. Okay, I've got both sides wet, and then I'm going to go back over the front with a relatively dry sponge with the water wrung out, and I'm just going to get some of that excess water off. I don't want it to be completely soaked, just damp. Now the reason I'm wetting both sides is so that the paper lays flat. So one thing I used to struggle with endlessly was curling paper. And so I would tape my paper down. And you can do that if you want, but this way you don't have to tape the paper down. Also, it'll give you more time to work wet into wet in that first wash if both sides of the paper are wet. And the first wash is all about painting the lightest colors, letting everything flow together and bloom, and it's very fuzzy and abstract. So let's get right into that. I'm going to mix up some sky colors to begin with here. Cerulean blue, just my go-to sky, nothing fancy. I usually do a mix of cerulean blue and cobalt blue to start. More heavy on the cerulean blue, and then I'll throw a little lavender in there just to make things a little less intense, to kind of neutralize that blue a bit. And then the sky will lighten up as it goes down towards the horizon. So I'm just going back and forth, getting some water, putting some paint on, getting some more water. I want the paint to flow on the palette. If you feel like it's kind of sticking and there's resistance to it, then there's probably not enough water. I'm going to throw in some of that cobalt turquoise light down here for where that sky transitions towards a lighter color on the horizon. So we'll just try to make a smooth gradient going across the top. Got a big mop brush or a quill brush for this. Having a nice big brush that holds a lot of water will help immensely with getting these smooth gradients. And I'm trying to keep my lines straight as I can as I move across. And right about there, we're going to start transitioning to that lighter blue that we've mixed ahead of time. Work that back up into the other color, and then continue down. And there's a few kind of streaks here and there, but it's all right. It's not a big deal. And I'm going to stop. I'm not going to touch the sky again. I'm going to leave it exactly as it is. I want to paint as much of this painting as I can with just one clean pass. I don't want to keep going back and working things over and over and over again. It's better to just leave it alone. You can get away with a certain amount of reworking if things are still wet, but past a certain point, it starts to look just like a mess, and we don't want that. Clearing off some space on my palette. I always have a little paper towel handy. I'm going to start painting that nice warm mountainside. Let's see, burnt umber, some burnt sienna, which I'm quickly running out of. I need to get more. We'll put some yellow ochre in there too, a nice yellowish warm color. Remember, this is just the first wash. We're only painting the lightest colors in this wash. Essentially what we're doing is painting the color of the light itself in this wash. What color is the light? Well, in this case, it's very warm on this mountainside because this is getting towards sunset time. It's dusk. And I really want that contrast between the warm mountainside, the cool sky, and then the cool foreground. We're going to come back in later and tighten up the shape of this mountain and put in all the shadows. And I am going to drop in the green color for that tree here in just a minute. Notice how the top of the mountain is kind of fuzzing a little bit, and that's okay. It gives it a nice kind of atmospheric effect. Drop in some of that warm color right there, where the sun's hitting the top of that bank. Mix up some nice warm colors for those tufts of grass poking up. Things are getting a little dry. So I've got my spray bottle. I'm just gonna give it a spritz. If you see that your paper's drying out on you too fast, that's a good way to kind of put more life into it. Kind of grayish color going on this side with this pile of stuff. Just mixing up some cobalt blue in burnt umber for this gray. Kind of goes back and forth between a warmer gray and a cooler gray. Paint around that branch because I'm going to make that a highlight. And we'll scratch out some more highlights later on. Drop in some more warm colors over here. Dropping some warm right there for where that little bit of sunlight is hitting the ground. Mix up some green for that Palo Verde tree right there. Just cobalt blue and cadmium yellow. Gives us a nice toned down green. Add some more cadmium yellow in here and there, kind of change the green up, make it more vibrant here, cooler there, constantly changing up the kind of green that I'm mixing. There's some more reddish areas in here too that I like. So many different colors going on in just this one tree. Again, see how all the colors are blending into one another? That's what we want. I'm not trying to force the watercolor to do anything in particular in this phase. I'm letting it flow, I'm letting it blend, I'm letting it do what watercolor does best. Water wants to flow. Just mixing that green on the palette into some of that warm color that I had for some of this other foliage that's more earthy green, that creosote kind of green. Letting all these colors touch and blend together. And we can even start dropping in some areas of more cool color for the shadow, the cast shadow here at the bottom of the wash. Oh, that's too much. That's a lot. Just take some from the edge of that puddle. And I really want to push that contrast between cool and warm right here. So painting some nice dark cools in at the start is going to help me push that contrast. It's all very abstract at this phase, which is nice because you can just kind of go for it. You don't have to worry about being precise with your shapes or anything like that. You can just kind of have fun with the different colors, let everything mix itself on the page. Because in the next wash is where we're gonna start painting some tighter shapes. You can start darkening up some areas in this pile ahead of time. I'm going to be painting a lot of wet into wet in this area, in this pile of branches. I want it to be a little more fuzzy and indistinct so that it doesn't draw too much attention, and then a few of the distinct branches that I want to show, I'm going to paint with a drier mixture over top of this once this is dry, and that will help those features stand out a little easier. You'll see what I mean. Okay, so there's our first wash done. Okay, so I need to let this paper dry. It's very important. Before we start the second wash, I need this to be completely dry. So I'm going to let this dry, and we'll continue with the second wash. Alright, so that first wash is dry, and you'll notice how the paint is lighter in value than when I first put it down. It's very important to understand that watercolor will dry several shades lighter than when you first put it on the paper. So it's something you got to keep in mind, and that's something I really struggled to get my head wrapped around at first, and it's always a tricky thing getting it right the first time when you put it on the paper, and that's just something that comes with a lot of practice. I've also gone quite a bit darker in the first wash with the shadow areas than I normally would, because I really want to push that contrast. So we're going to start painting our big middle value shape, which is what we have in our value study. So I've already got it all mapped out. I just need to essentially paint my value study again, but in color. Now I'm going to start with the foreground area that's in shadow. I'm going to be doing a lot of dry brushing, which is kind of letting the brush skip over the top of the paper, create some texture, show some of that gritty, rocky texture. Trying to stay loose, resisting the urge to paint over the same area again and again. You've also probably noticed that I've pre-mixed a bunch of colors on my palette that will come in very handy as I do this second wash. That way I don't have to keep going back and worrying about mixing things over and over again, and I can just paint things as one big continuous shape a lot more easily. So there's that highlight right there on that branch. I'm going to paint around that. I want to preserve that highlight. I'll paint around a few other branches here and there too as we move into this pile of sticks. Who knew a pile of sticks would be so stressful? But I feel a lot less stressed out about it now after having done that value study, because, well, just a big abstract shape now. I'm not really painting a pile of sticks, I'm painting the shape I'm seeing in the value study. And there's that area where you got some of that dappled sunlight showing through. And I even noticed a little bit of purpley color going on right here, which I'm going to drop in. Already had that mixed up on the palette, ready to go. I've got this rag off to the right that I'm tapping my brush into every now and then, and that's so I can control the amount of water on my brush. Don't want too much water on there, because that's how you get blooms and cauliflower edges. nice gray color. Let's see, where are we gonna move next? Since I painted this side first, I'm gonna continue on this side. I always gotta make sure that I have a wet edge to paint into in order to make this one continuous fluid shape. You gotta constantly be watching your edges. Right here, it turns into kind of a warmer color. Let's see how that's blending right into that cooler shape that I painted. It's what I want. I want to find all these areas where the paint can connect and flow into itself. Move back to this other side and paint some of this stuff here. There's so many different beautiful colors and textures going on in this scene, and I'm really trying to do it justice. The star of this scene is definitely the light and this tree right here, but mostly the light. That's what caught my eye about this, was just how amazing the light looked shining into this wash, and then you got the mountains in the background. The desert has just such a harsh, unforgiving beauty to it. I've really learned to appreciate the beauty of the desert, learning how to paint it. You really just dig into the details in a way that you never would otherwise. Continuing with the shadows back here. Kind of switching back and forth between cool and warmer gray. I'm painting over this grass right here. I'm going to give it a little texture by splaying out this brush so it's got some teeth. I'm just painting downward in these little strokes. Painting in this palette right here, I'm using a lot of dry brushing to emulate that kind of wispy foliage that it has. I'm using the side of my brush to get that nice effect. Really helps if your paper has a bit of texture to it as well, if you're gonna use that technique. Giving this tree right here some texture with that same kind of dry brush technique. Scratch out a few sticks on this side. Looks like it's about dry enough to do that. I'm just using my fingernail, the edge of my fingernail. It's a little too dry in a few spots, but that's alright. Do the same thing in this bush here, scratch out a few light colored branches. If your paper is too wet, or the paint is too wet, you won't really be able to scratch. But if it's too dry, you also won't be able to scratch. So it's got to be kind of just the right balance between wet and dry. Now we can start working in, let's see. Darken that up a little bit right there. Start painting some of the shadows and textures on that mountainside. Start with that very distant one here. I'm going to use a pretty light wash of this bluish color. Move up into these shadows right here. I'm painting around the top of the canopy of this Palo Verde, and having the shadow on the mountain behind it is going to really pop out that highlight off the top of the tree. Just giving a little bit of texture here and there, using the side of my brush. I think we're ready to start working in some of our darks now. And still, if I were to say, yeah, this doesn't look very good, I'm giving up on it, well, I haven't done the third wash yet. So I'm going to keep pushing ahead. A lot of times watercolor doesn't look like a finished painting until the very last, like, 5 minutes. And then it all kind of comes together and you're like, oh, there's the painting. I did a little spritz on just that area there to kind of make these more distant mountain hills fade into the distance. I just want them to kind of fuzz out a little bit, so I gave a little bit of spritz just in that area. Yeah, I'm really liking the contrast between warm and cool that's going on. I think it's looking pretty good so far. So let's see. I'm just going to add a bit of texture to this grass. Might glaze over this area in some orange, same with that, but I'm not sure yet, we'll see. See, I'm not worried about painting each individual shrub. I'm painting everything as one big shape. So now I'm just looking at my value study and seeing which areas I need to darken up. And work on this Palo Verde right here. Darkening up a few areas here and there on this bank, giving it a little extra texture within this shadow. Just tapping a little bit with my brush. Get some of that gritty texture in this foreground area here. Painting some branches and sticks and random stuff right here. I just noticed these little plants poking up right here in the photo, and I'm going to throw those in there. It's a nice little detail. You can really have a lot of fun with the small details in this stage, but it's important not to go too overboard with the small details, or you'll make your painting too busy. You gotta kind of know when enough is enough, and that, again, like I said before, just comes with a lot of practice. One of the biggest lessons watercolor has taught me is how to be consistent and persistent and just keep showing up no matter what. Even on days I didn't feel like painting, I would force myself to sit down and at least try to paint something. Because let's be honest, watercolor can be extraordinarily frustrating, especially when you're just trying to understand what's going on. There are so many things to think about, so many variables that can affect how your painting turns out. It's a lot. It is a lot. It can be very overwhelming. And when you're first starting out and all of these steps that I'm showing you aren't second nature yet, and you have to sit down and think like, okay, what do I need to do next? What's the next thing I need to do? Sometimes the painting can just get away from you, but that's why you got to put in the reps. You got to just keep showing up And eventually, one day you'll realize, oh, I'm just painting. I'm not really thinking about what I'm doing. I'm just doing it. I think about it like learning to drive a car. When you first learn how to drive, if you've ever learned how to drive, for a while it was probably super overwhelming and you had no idea what was going on. And it was probably even a little scary. For me, it was. Because there's so many different variables to think about, so much to watch out for. And painting is similar, especially watercolor, where you kind of have to just put paint on the paper and hope for the best sometimes. But the more you practice it, the longer you stick with it, it really does get easier, as crazy as it sounds. So just keep going. Don't stop. Just keep pushing yourself to paint. Find ways to motivate yourself. Listen, if I can learn how to paint watercolor, you absolutely can do it. Watercolor taught me that I am capable of sticking with something that's really difficult, and that I'm capable of learning how to do really difficult things if it's something that I want badly enough. I did not necessarily know that about myself before I started learning how to paint. I went from not even knowing how to mix green. I'm not even kidding you. I didn't even know what colors made green. To the painting I showed you before, to what I'm painting now. Which I'm pretty happy with how this is all coming together. And I will admit to you right now, there was a moment in this very painting when I wondered if it was going to turn out. There were several moments like that where I wondered, is this even going to work? You would be shocked at how often that still happens to me. But I just keep painting, just keep going. Because you might surprise yourself. You just might surprise yourself with how things turn out. And this big old pile of sticks that I was so worried about painting because of how complex it was, I mean, it's not a big deal now. At this point, I'm just adding a little extra texture here and there and darkening up some areas around some of these branches to make them pop out a little more, but other than that, it's really not that bad. And doing that value study was what made such a huge difference for me. Okay, I like this branch kind of sticking out here, out in midair. Darken up the bottom of that so it's a little more obvious. Scratch out a few more random stuff. Yeah, we got that nice little splash of light right there, very subtle. Let's see, what else? Is there anything else this painting needs before I'm comfortable calling it done? It's looking pretty dang good. Mountain needs a little tiny bit more texture, I think. Just a little bit. So I'll just dry brush some warmish, a very light wash of warm colors. And you want to do this when the paint underneath is dry, if you're going to glaze like this. You don't want to do this if the paint is still wet underneath, because you'll just pick up that paint underneath and it'll become a muddy mess. Maybe indicate some foliage on the mountainside too. Just drop in some green here and there. Maybe one sticking up over the top here and there too. Maybe some cactus. Just gonna tap a little more texture into this part of the ground here. And there's one more thing I want to do. This is kind of something I like to do towards the end of a painting if I feel like it could use it. I'm going to create a little sparkle in this area. This is ending up being kind of a nice little kind of spotlight effect in this painting. There's a nice glow happening right there. Did not plan on doing that, by the way. It just kind of turned out that way. The watercolor decided that that's what it was going to do, and I really like it. Sometimes watercolor has a better plan in mind for the painting than you do, and you just have to go with it. Watercolor is not a medium that you can just beat into submission. You cannot do that. It will not let you do that. So it's better to just work with what it's deciding to give you, even if it's slightly different than what you had in mind. So I'm going to take some white artist gouache. Just going to put a little tiny bit on the palette, get it a little wet. I don't want to get it too wet. About like that. I'm just going to tap around in this area right here and create a little bit of a sparkly effect. I think that will really bring this home. Yeah, just like that. Now gouache is opposite of watercolor and will dry darker than when you put it on. So just something to keep in mind. We'll continue that sparkle on down this way. Kind of gives you the idea of like dust motes floating in the air or insects buzzing around, especially during these like late afternoon dusk kind of scenes. I really love doing this. It's such a cool effect. Okay, so there you have it. There's a finished painting. So let's look at the old painting and then we'll compare it to this one and we'll see what's different. Okay, here's wow. That's funny. Wow. So here's the painting from 2020. All right, which we've already discussed. Here's the painting I just did. Quite the dramatic difference. There's just so much more vibrancy going on in this painting, and you can see how everything is forming this one big connected shape. The splatters are a little bit much at the moment, but remember the gouache is going to dry and it's going to lighten up, so it won't be so obvious and distracting. It will kind of fade into the background. And I really am happy with the contrast between light and dark, or I should say warm and cool that I got. So that just shows you what can happen if you stick with it, if you keep going, if you just keep showing up, putting in the work, putting in the time, practicing. You can make paintings that look like this. I know that you can. If I can go from this to that, you can do it too. And I hope that the techniques that I've showed you today help get you a little closer to that. So if you've made it this far, I cannot thank you enough for watching. Please like this video and subscribe if you haven't already done so. Share it with your artsy friends or your non-artsy friends, whoever you want. And let me know if what I shared in this video you found helpful. And I hope to see you on the next one.